Okay, we're going to start session on the S word, on sex. Let me ask you this. How many of you have heard biblical teaching on sex from the pulpit? There's a few, not very many. This is something that we tend to just avoid, and it's probably one of the subjects that we need to least avoid. There's sort of a theme that talked about basics in marriage, talked about love in marriage, and talked with the guys about loving your wife, and Lorinda's talked with the ladies about respecting your husband. There's differences in perspective between men and women. And so to sort of start this out, let me give you a list of how to impress a woman and how to impress a man. How to impress a woman. You love her, you listen to her, you hold her, you cherish her, you honor her, you please her, you tease her, you touch her, you talk to her. For a man, show up naked, bring food. A little less complicated. Okay, sex in marriage. A word of caution. A few years ago, did a presentation in Hillcrest Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, and we did this in January, and then by July, 75% of those couples were pregnant. So, I'll leave it up to you. Sexual relations. We're going to talk about the importance of sexual relations. Generally, when I teach on sex, and I've never lost anyone yet, okay? Never had anyone pass out or get up and leave. But generally, when I do this, it falls into two groups. There's one group that, their eyes go down to their page and they're taking copious notes and they won't make eye contact with me. And then there's another group, and they're sort of called the locker room crowd, and they sort of are usually in the back about where Joel is, going woo, woo, woo. So I don't know which group you're in, but I'll let you decide on that. First, sex was God's idea. If you go back and look in Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:25, God created sex. And we've allowed the world to hijack sexuality, to pervert it, to make it something that God did not intend it to be. Sex is something that is a vital part of marriage. I did come up with a photo of Joe and Jesse, but so sex continues. It's basic to marriage, but sexual problems do exist in every marriage at some time or another. And you can probably take those and put them in a couple of boxes. Number one is sin. We have allowed the world to pervert God's gift of sexuality. Working with people over the years, I've seen situations that, there's no easy way out. It's just sin. I mean, when a wife becomes pregnant by another man, a wife was having a relationship outside of marriage and didn't seem to figure out what was going on, and found out later it was a lesbian relationship. So I've sort of seen it all from A to Z as how you can pervert sexuality. If that's the problem, it's sin and needs to be addressed as sin. And what I'd suggest to you is go to your pastor or someone that can help you address this as sin. Sometimes it's organic. hormonal imbalances. Sometimes medications can lead to intimacy or impotency. It's different between those two words. So this is a physiological problem. And I would suggest you go find a good Christian doctor and take it from there. Sometimes it's symptoms of deeper problems, psychological rather than physiological. Could be something that happened, abuse as a child, sexual abuse as a child, or a lot of different things that could happen. I suggest in that case you go to a good Christian counselor. And when I say Christian counselor, not just a counselor who is a Christian, but a counselor who is a Christian and counsels by biblical principles, because there's a difference there, and you need to know that. And then ignorance and misinformation. This is what we're going to address today, because if I were to ask each of you, where did you first learn about sex? It was probably from someone that was not an expert, someone, whether it was the playground or your best friend, and one of those situations where you pooled your ignorance and had discussions. And we tend as Christians, and this is what concerns me, is we just sort of avoid talking about sexuality. It's like Christians don't do that. Well, obviously Christians do that because where do all the little Christians come from? Something's happening. So by the fact that we bury our heads in the sand and we do not teach that this is a gift from God and how it's to be handled. So let's jump in. A biblical perspective of sex. Sex is not a four-letter word. And in Genesis 1:31 it says, "And behold, it was very good." When you start looking through the Scriptures, in Hebrews 13:4, sex is God's plan. Marriage is honorable and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. If you take that verse and break it down, marriage is honorable. It means it's esteemed and valuable and all. And the bed, it was translated out of the Greek to bed in the King James, but comes from the Greek word koite, which means coitus, which is sexual relations. So it's very specific. It's saying that sexual relations are undefiled, unstained, pure, and chaste. And we are fed this line that if you're a Christian, you can enjoy sex. Let me give you the results. This was a Red Book survey of 200,000 women, and found that sexual enjoyment is directly proportional to religious belief. So God says, sex is good, I've given it to you as a gift, and you are to enjoy it. Now, sex is God's gift. Look in Proverbs and Song of Solomon. Proverbs says, "Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as a loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love." Now, jump over into Song of Solomon. This is Solomon, or Shulamite, who was Solomon's wife, speaking. Says, "His legs are as pillars of marble, set upon sockets of fine gold. His countenance is as Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. His mouth is most sweet, yea, is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem." Shulamite was talking to her friends, and basically what she's saying is, this man of mine is a hunk. Now, ladies, it may be, instead of pillars of marble set upon sockets of gold, at this point in the marriage, it may be like 2 columns of Jell-O set on a big Oreo. But the point is, it's okay for you to enjoy your husband physically. And if you jump on over to 7 and verse 7 and 8, Solomon is talking. He says, "This is thy statue. Thy statue is like a palm tree, and thy breasts are to clusters of grapes. I said, I will go up to the palm tree. I will take hold of the boughs thereof. Now also thy breast shall be as clusters of the vine, and the smell of thy nose like apples." Now, read that in like the Message or something else. Basically, what it's saying, Solomon's saying, my wife is hot. I mean, I enjoy her physically. And that's okay. We are to do that for each other. Here's an older version I would recommend to you sometime. There's a study, the Song of Solomon, written by Tommy Nelson. He's spoken on this several times. I've heard him a couple of times. Really good to go back and look. Just the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon is actually used by Hebrew people to teach sexual relations to their children. And, some people say, well, it's an allegory and it's talking about spiritual things. Well, that's true too. But when you read it, it's talking about physical sex. And it says it's good. And it's within marriage. We were created for mutual pleasure and enjoyment. We are created. Our bodies are created to be stimulated physically, sexually. It's within marriage to be unrestrained and guilt-free, and we tend to focus on the thou shalt nots to the point that we don't teach that marriage is a gift. Sex is the most intense emotional, physical stimulation. And then it's for mutual expression of love. It is the most intimate expression of love. It's to be shared with the mate only. It's the complete giving of oneself to the other, and it is the ultimate union. That's why unfaithfulness sexually in a marriage, because it's the ultimate union, it is so destructive. Now, it's probably one of the more difficult problems to work through in a marriage if one has been sexually unfaithful. But again, that can be restored. But it is probably one of the more difficult ones. Now, we're going to talk about sexuality, male and female. Male and female created He, them. There is a difference, a big difference. There's a physiological and emotional difference. And you ignore these differences, it's going to really produce some problems in marriage. Learning and applying knowledge produces solutions. And we need to know that. It doesn't come naturally. I mean, typically what happens is we get no training in sexuality. I mean, in the schools, it's all the sort of mechanics of it. But to teach people what it means from a biblical perspective, when we do premarital counseling, this is one thing that we cover. I mean, they have to go through a video version of the seminar, and then we give them some books that they are to read. It must be learned and admitted, and it must be applied. Now, I was in Colorado on a ski lift. Got on the ski lift. Of course, I was on the greens and the kids were on the blacks and blues. And so I was entertaining myself, so I hopped on the ski lift and go up, and this guy was telling me how he first learned to ski. He said, yeah, I moved out here from the East Coast, and I never skied before that much, and so my friend lived in Denver, and so we came up. He said, I'll teach you to ski. So he came up, went to the shop and got, the boots and the skis and everything. And he said, okay, how do I learn? He said, don't worry about it, I'll teach you. And so rather than going into a ski school, he went to the lift and got up on the lift and started up. And he said, are you sure about this? Yeah, no problem, I can teach you to ski. And so they got to the top and he got off the lift and, didn't kill himself. But then he said, okay, now you're going to teach me how to ski. He said, yeah, come on over here. So they went over to the edge of the slope and said, look, there's nothing to it. You just go over the edge and you'll learn. It'll just come natural. I said, okay. So he went over the edge. He didn't know about snow plowing. He didn't know about working the slopes. And so he just picked up further and, speed further and further and got faster and faster, and he didn't know just to fall backwards or whatever. And so he went down, all the way down, thankfully it was a green, all the way down to the end. There was a big pile of snow they'd cleared off from a parking lot, and he hit that, went up, and ended up spread eagle in the parking lot. My point is this. I want to teach you about sexuality. I hope you don't end up spread eagle in a parking lot, okay? Let's talk about what God says. I'm going to talk with you about physical, sexual structure. You need to know what, where, and how. This is my hero. I taught this couple. He was 82, she was 79. They'd been married 60 years. And they came to a marriage seminar. And were sitting in metal chairs. I mean, they didn't even have the cushions. It was metal chairs. And so he sat through all the morning session and the afternoon session. He had some of the guys go in the back in the nursery and bring out a recliner, and he wanted to sit right up front because he didn't want to miss the session on sexuality. So he's my hero. I always want to be learning. So you can always learn. Let's talk about biblical basis. There's 3 books. I can add to these books, but here are 3 books I would recommend to you. Tim and Beverly Hay, an older book called The Act of Marriage. Ed and Gay Wheat, this is a really older book, but Intended for Pleasure. I would highly recommend that to you. And then The Gift of Sex, Clifford and Joyce Penner. I would suggest, I don't care how many years you've been married, but you would get at least one of these books. And there's some other books that we can recommend. We'll have I think we've got a list in the back. I recommend that you read that. And you might be saying, well, I feel awkward about ordering a book on sex, Well, order it from Amazon. It'll come in a plain brown wrapper. Or if you really are embarrassed about it, take your money, give it to Joe, and he'll buy it for you and give it to you, okay? And then another one, Sex for Christians by Louis B. Smedes. Either one of those. When we do premarital counseling, there's several other books that we recommend, but we have them read through a book. That's sort of what the current looks like. But pick up one of these books. Now, we're sort of going to get into some of the nitty-gritty right now, and then I want to talk about principles. Patterns of sexual response. There's some similarities between males and females, and there's some differences. Let's talk about the similarities. Similarities all go through 4 phases: excitement phase, plateau phase, orgasmic, and then the resolution. And they're very, very similar. So the responses are about the same. Some studies show that female response is maybe even a little more intense. But if you start looking at the different phases, this is a typical male response. The slopes are fairly steep, fairly quickly, and then drops off. This is a typical female, usually much longer period of time, and then peaks and then slopes more gradually than a male tends to be more like an act. The female tends to be more like an event. It takes longer for the female than for the male. Now, let's talk about the stimulation and arousal. For the husband, men are stimulated visually. That's why you see commercials on beer by scantily clad women. Why? Because they're on Saturday afternoon, they're flipping through the channels, ka-chunk, 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 and then you hit a beer commercial and it's because it catches attention. Men are stimulated visually. That's why pornography is a multi-billion-dollar business. And that's why it's so destructive. What are they stimulated by? A female body, relatively independent of whose body. And this is very difficult for women to understand. How could you be stimulated by someone else's body? It's because we tend to be stimulated visually. That's why we have to be very careful about what we see, what we watch. There's an involuntary, but there's a voluntary aspect of stimulation for males. Now, don't let me explain. David, he was where he shouldn't have been, but he saw Bathsheba and he was stimulated. But he had a choice. He could turn and leave or stay and look. And he chose to stay and look. So I'm not letting men off the hook because they're stimulated visually. I'm saying you need to be aware of that, and you need to be cautious and careful about what you watch. And if you see something that you didn't need to see, then you turn and leave. You don't stay and look. Now, with men, it's more of a segmented relationship. Therefore, you have to look. In other words, we'll talk about this by looking at the other side. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more externally and internally, but it tends to be more of an emotional stimulation from a sense of being loved, cherished, and valued. That's why women will pick up and read Harlequin romances. Why? Because in the plot of a typical Harlequin romance, men don't read those because, first of all, there's no pictures. Second, we don't understand it because in there the hero comes in, he woos, he makes the woman feel loved, cherished, and valued, and then she allows herself to be stimulated. Now, there's such thing as visual pornography, but there's also such things as emotional pornography. So what visual stimulation is to men, emotional stimulation is to women. So what I'm saying, women, is be careful about what you read. I mean, it goes from things which seem innocent, like Harlequin romances, all the way to 50 Shades of Grey. In other words, you need to be careful about what stirs you emotionally. A wife needs to feel courted, or she will feel used. It's more of a voluntary in allowing someone to arouse her sexually that makes her feel loved, cherished, and valued. But with a wife, it's more of a total relationship. Let me give you, we'll talk about that a little more. What about the excitement phase? Males is much quicker, females over a longer period of time. What about the frequency, the excitement? It's regularly for men, typically. Wives are amazed at how frequently. There's a physiological basis and typically runs on about a 72-hour cycle for men. And wives tend to underestimate the buildup of the husband's sexual tension. For the wife, generally, it's less frequently, and there is larger variation in wives. It tends to be less pressing than the husband's desire. And the husband sometimes tend to question his wife's, what he thinks is a lack of sexual interest, when it is not a lack of sexual interest. It's just that the arousal is slower and less frequent. Now, the response is relatively quickly for a husband to respond. It can be minutes, whereas, seconds to minutes. And this ready to go at any time attitude is not depraved. It's the way God made men to be stimulated. With a wife, it's much slower. It can be minutes to hours, or it could be over days. But it can't be hurried. One of the best illustrations I've heard of the difference between the response time sexually of a husband and wife is that husband's more like a microwave, wife's more like a crock pot. And, the question is, which cooks better? Well, they both cook well. It's just a difference. It's how God made us. Now, let's go on to the plateau phase. For the male, it's much shorter. For the female, it's much longer. It's short, must be controlled. There's a hurry tendency. For the wife, it's longer. There's physiological changes taking place with the wife. And there's this wait tendency. So there's, again, the differences in the physiological changes with husbands and wives. And then the orgasmic phase, for a husband, it's much quicker. For a wife, it's over a period of time. A husband is capable of normally just one orgasmic peak, where wives are capable of multiple. There's similar tendencies. And as I said, the female's peak may actually be more intense than the male's. And there's always this idea going into a marriage that this all happens at the same time. Well, it doesn't happen at the same time. The technical term is called synopulation, or this synchronization, but the technical term is synopulation, of happening at the same time. Well, they're not going to happen at the same time. In fact, is it desirable? Well, it depends upon the individuals. It's not automatic, but if it's going to happen, it's got to be planned. But if not simultaneous, then it would be better for the wife first. And why is that? We'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, then the resolution phase. With the husband, it drops down all of a sudden. And with the husband, there's a quick diminish, a complete relaxation, and a loss of interest. So with the husband, there's a tendency, okay, we've done that, then roll over, get up, get out of bed, go mow the yard, get on to the next project. And with the female, there's this extended diminish, it's called afterglow. And there's a need of continued expression of affection. And so what's happening with her is, if the husband goes through that phase first, and then he's ready to go mow the yard, then she's laying there wondering, who was that masked man? In other words, what happened? You know, I don't know what's going on. Now, this is important. Why is it important? Because you can really end up emotionally really causing some harm. You've got to understand the difference between men and women. You know, it explains a lot of things. Men, as I said, are much more segmented. And women are much more holistic. And even the response time. This explains things, ladies. I mean, it's like you could have been out working in the yard all day. You could have been doing anything from fixing a flower bed to splitting wood. And he's exhausted. And you come in, you know, at sundown, and he says, babe, I am so tired. Let's don't even worry about supper. Let's just go to bed. So he runs in and takes a shower. And he goes and lays in the bed. He is just dead. And then, ladies, you go take a shower and you make two mistakes. Number one, you put on something that's scanty, and you walk across the edge, the foot of the bed with the light still on. Then all of a sudden, that which was dead is now alive. I mean, he's responsive. And you think, you've got to be perverted. Well, that's because he is stimulated visually. On the other hand, guys, it can be that you've come home early, you've helped with the dishes, you put the kids to bed at 6:30 or 7, and you think this is going to be a great night. And so you've even helped with the vacuuming. And so you go to bed, and all of a sudden things are great. And then down the hallway comes this little voice, Mama! It's over, because she's much more holistic. what affects her in one area of her life affects her in other areas of her life. So there's a big difference there. Now, that's sort of the differences. I want to dig in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 through 5. Corinth. This is a picture at the top of Corinth. We were there last fall with Dave and Melissa. Corinth was a seaport where sea lanes crossed and overland trade routes crossed. So it was the hub. It was often referred to as the sailor's delight. And this is a picture of up on top of a mountain there where the temple of Aphrodite. Aphrodite was the goddess of love. And in that temple there were 1,000 priestesses. Essentially they were temple prostitutes. And as it was, the worship service essentially was you go make your offering at the temple and then you have sexual relations with one of the temple prostitutes. So out of that culture came the Corinthian church. The believers came out of that culture. And so this is why Paul is writing to them about sexuality, because they had such a perverted view of sexuality. Now, look at this. This is very parallel with what it says about men, it says about women. There's a tendency in culture to think that sex is a man thing and not a woman thing. God gave sexuality as a gift to men and to women. Let every man have his own wife. Let every woman have her own husband. So what's that saying? It's a husband-wife relationship. Damage results outside the marriage bond. I cannot overemphasize that. In Thessalonians, premarital sex is fornication. Extramarital sex and marriage is adultery. Tremendous warnings given on that. Joy and unity result inside the marriage bond. Sexual relations are intended for pleasure. We've talked about that. They strengthen the sense of unity. Now, let me give you a visual illustration. Sex is a gift. It can be tremendously damaging, or it can be tremendously unifying in a marriage. Like a campfire. A campfire is within bounds. So if we handle sex within God's bounds, then it's going to be a blessing to us. Have you ever been around a house fire or a forest fire? It's terribly destructive, and this is what happens with sexuality outside of the bounds of marriage. It's unselfish affection. It says, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. It's an expression of love and affection. Now, this is the key. If you want to take up what's the difference between a secular view of sex and a biblical view of sex. A secular view of sex is self-satisfaction. However, I can be satisfied. A biblical view is satisfying your spouse sexually. It's our duty to fulfill each other sexually. Your body is given to the mate. In fact, if you look at verse 4, it says that when we say I do, we give our sexuality to each other. So what right do I have to have my sexuality involved with another woman when I've given it to my wife? Vice versa for the wife. It's to be mutual, active participation. Just a thought. Within marriage, that circle is where sex is to be consummated. Outside, it's out of bounds. All of the needs of your spouse can be fulfilled outside of marriage if necessary. If you're a deadbeat husband and you won't take care of your wife financially, the church or someone else could. Vice versa. If you don't take care of your wife emotionally, she could have friends, she could have someone else that could do that for her. But sex is the only thing that it only can be fulfilled within marriage. And it says sex is to be uninterrupted. Defraud ye not the other. Now don't panic on me, lady. I'm not saying sex is supposed to be a marathon. But it talks about it's to be continuous over a period of time. It's to be regular. Of course, that is how regular is regular, you ask. Well, what is regular is what's regular for you and your mate. You live with a sexual expert. You are given the command to satisfy them sexually, no one else. So that's why it's important that husband and wife to have discussions about sex and sexuality, even down to what you like, what you dislike, how frequent, how less frequent. But it depends upon you and your mate. You don't need anyone else. But I'll give you some statistics. This is from the act of marriage. The red is the husband's desire. The green is the wife's desire. And you can see generally the husband's desire is more frequent than the wife. And then the actual is less than either one of them because it's this mutual satisfaction. Now, let's talk about the principles. Be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love and honor preferring one another. So what does that mean? Exhibit mutual love and consideration. If we're focused on satisfying ourselves, it's going to lead to polarization in your marriage. If you focus on satisfying your mate, it's going to be unitization. That's a big difference between the secular and biblical view. Don't underestimate your mate's vulnerability. The wife's sensitive area is care and consideration. The husband's is rejection, to sense that I'm being rejected. There must be time. And you say, well, not for sex. Well, it is. Ecclesiastes says there's a time for everything. There must be a place. I recommend to every couple, particularly with young kids in the home, you have a bedroom that you teach the kids that sometimes mom and dad will be in there without them. Put a lock on the door. Now the fear is you're going to be in there and you're going to hear this little knock on the door with the question of what's going on in there? Well, jump over into parenting. A child only needs to be told what they can handle at the time. So you tell them we were wrestling. The next question is going to be, who won? And you say, we both won. Leave it at that, okay? And said, except it be with consent for a time that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Suspension of regular sexual relations is to be by mutual consent, for a good reason, and then never to be used as a bargaining tool or weapon. This is a situation where you can win the battle and lose the war. Because if you start using sex as a bargaining chip, you're going to end up with some severe problems. But it says come together. What's incontinency? Inability to control yourself. That's what the verse is saying. Continuation removes temptation, meets physical needs, meets emotional needs. Then, to sum it up, what I would say to husbands and wives together is this. Mutual sexual satisfaction is necessary. It's a necessary element in God's plan for a complete marriage. It doesn't come naturally, but by conscious, loving efforts of learning what satisfies your mate and taking those actions. To a husband, I would say, your wife needs to be shown that she's cherished and valued and that her total fulfillment is important to you. Your actions that demonstrate this love, in turn, enhances her ability to respond to you sexually. And then to the wife, your husband needs to be assured of your affection for him by regular and loving sexual relations. Sexual satisfaction enhances his ability to respond with cherishing and endearing actions to you. In other words, focus on meeting the needs, whether it's unconditional love, whether it's sex, whatever. It's meeting each other's. Again, just a promo for a retreat that's coming up this fall. Well, this weekend. We do have pastor and missionary scholarships for that. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, I'm 3 minutes over, so we're going to. At the hour? Oh, great. At the hour. Questions? Seriously. Questions, comments?
Yeah, their kids won't be back to 2 o'clock. You have a homework assignment for them.
That's right. The kids will not be back until 2 o'clock. So you have time. Okay, well, what we'll do then is give you a few extra minutes on a break, and we'll start back at 10 after, right?
Yeah. In the next section, we'll be